Former commanding general of US Army Europe, Ben Hodges, shocked everyone with a single, brutal truth. He said no ceasefire, no pause, no handshake will stop Russia. Only total, undeniable defeat will. And that defeat, it's closer than anyone thinks. And Hodges isn't the only one who believes that. Let's talk about it. Before we dive in, let's introduce the experts who've given us plenty to talk about. As mentioned, the first is Ben Hodges, a retired US Army Lieutenant General with decades of military leadership experience. Hodges served as the commanding general of US Army Europe from 2014 to 17, overseeing critical operations in Europe and NATO. Since retiring, Hodges has become a sought-after military analyst. His deep understanding of military strategy, European security, and NATO's roles gives his insights unmatched credibility. He shared his views on the war in Ukraine in numerous interviews, including the one on the Gaze YouTube channel from Ukraine, which started our current conversation. Not even 10 days later, another important voice entered the conversation, Robert Fox, the defense editor at the London Standard, a well-known and long-established British newspaper. With more than 50 years of experience in journalism, Fox is an authority on military and security issues. He has covered conflicts ranging from the Falklands War to Iraq, the Balkans and Afghanistan, and now writes regularly on the war in Ukraine. His deep knowledge of global defense matters has earned him numerous accolades, including the MBE, member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Fox is also an associate fellow at the Centre for Defence Studies, a world-leading centre for defence and security research, and has worked as a foreign affairs commentator for outlets like the BBC and Times Radio. Times Radio is precisely where he shared his predictions about Russia's imminent defeat. Here's what the combined insights of these two experts tell us about Russia's future. Let's start with the current situation on the ground, because it's only in this context that their predictions truly make sense. When asked what phase of the war is currently taking place in Ukraine, Hodges gave a rather sobering but sharp assessment. If you're a soldier in a trench, in Pokrovsk, or in some places like that, it's terrible. And there's no exaggeration in that. The eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk has been under relentless assault. Ukrainian drone teams stationed there call it an urban apocalypse, a battlefield so shattered by Russian attacks that parts of it now seem uninhabitable. In just one recent wave of fighting, the Pokrovsk front endured 52 Russian assaults in a single day, with Ukrainian forces barely holding their ground across surrounding settlements like Kalinova, Lysivka, and Tarasivka. But not everywhere is the same. If you're a Ukrainian soldier in the Kursk direction, things look a little bit better, Hodges added, hinting at Ukraine's surprising push across the border into Russia at the end of 2024. At one point, Ukrainian forces controlled over 540 square miles in Kursk, a move meant to disrupt Russian logistics and create pressure. But in recent weeks, Russia has hit back hard, retaking most of the ground. Ukraine still holds about 22 square miles and forcing a Ukrainian withdrawal. From late February to mid-March alone, Ukraine lost 122 pieces of equipment in the fight, mostly armored fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery and tanks. So what began as a bold raid eventually became logistically unsustainable. Still, Ukraine remains active inside Russian territory, primarily in Belgorod, where new operations are now underway. Plus, even though the Kursk operation is nearing its end, it's already done its job masterfully. As Hodges explains, this operation destroyed the myth that the Russian army could never be defeated. Hodges also looked at the big picture, saying, if you're in the Kremlin, or if you're responsible for the Russian economy, not so good. In other words, while the war drags on militarily, it's draining Russia economically and politically behind the scenes, and it's only going to get worse. According to economists polled by Reuters, Russia's GDP growth is expected to slow to 1.7% in 2025 compared to 4.1% in 2024. So where does all this leave us? According to Hodges, we're in this phase where neither side can knock out the other. But this isn't just a stalemate, it's something more complex. He described it as an industrial competition, a race of endurance. Can Russia achieve what it needs before its economy collapses? Or can Ukraine achieve what it wants before negotiations? That's the phase we're in, a war of attrition, military, economic, and psychological, and the clock is ticking for both sides. Of course, according to Hodges and Fox, Russia's hourglass is the one that's nearly empty. But this didn't happen overnight. With this in mind, let's see what these experts believe brought Russia to the brink of collapse, including some truly poor decisions by the country's President Vladimir Putin. When asked what surprised him most about the Russian army, Hodges singled out three things. First up, the army's underperformance. Simply put, Hodges expected the Russian army to do much better, and this isn't limited to the army. He had expected the entire Russian forces, the army, air force, and navy, to perform much better. Instead, Russia's military was thrown into chaos, a large part of which can be attributed to disastrous planning. As Hodges explained, the military's operation wasn't orchestrated by the General Staff, but rather by the FSB, Russia's principal security agency, which led to a poorly conceived strategy from the start. This catastrophic miscalculation has come with staggering consequences. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, the Russian military has taken enormous losses. As of April 8, 2025, Ukraine's General Staff reported that Russia has lost 926,310 troops, with that number including killed, injured, and captured soldiers. But the damage doesn't stop there. Russia has also lost 10,572 tanks, 22,011 armored fighting vehicles, and 43,227 vehicles and fuel tanks. Moreover, Russian forces have seen the destruction of 25,860 artillery systems, 1,359 multiple-launch rocket systems, and 1,126 air defense systems, severely crippling their ability to respond to attacks. The Russian Air Force has also been decimated, with 370 airplanes and 335 helicopters downed. Speaking of the Russian Air Force, the second thing that surprised Hodges has to do with its actions, or inactions rather. As he put it, the second thing about the Russian side that has surprised me is the failure of the Air Force to achieve air superiority. This huge failure, as Hodges describes it, has been proven to be one of the most significant shortcomings of Russia's military strategy. The Russian Air Force failed to achieve air superiority for several critical reasons, despite its numerical advantage. These include effective Ukrainian air defenses with advanced systems like the Patriot and S-300 forcing Russian aircraft to fly at low, vulnerable altitudes, corruption and maintenance issues that reduced the operational readiness of Russian aircraft, poor situational awareness and inadequate coordination between Russian air and ground forces, which hindered effective operations. The Russian Air Force also severely overestimated its capabilities, which seems to be a common thread for all the country's military branches. This leads us to the third thing that surprised Hodges: Russia's need to rely on North Korea for ammunition and drones. As he explained, "I would never have guessed that Russia would require ammunition and drones from North Korea. This was a major shock, highlighting how far Russia's resources have been stretched." The country, unable to produce enough supplies on its own, turned to North Korea, which began sending artillery shells, ammunition, and newer weapon systems. And the scale of this reliance is staggering. By October 2024, it was estimated that North Korea had supplied Russia with over 20,000 containers of ammunition. That's over 9 million shells. It's no wonder that Ukrainian intelligence estimated that as much as 60% of the shells fired by Russia's artillery forces in late 2024 came from North Korea. But North Korea didn't only send weapons. One of the more bizarre and questionable decisions by the Kremlin during this war was the deployment of North Korean troops. As Hodges explained, Russia probably needed more soldiers, more bodies, especially people that are already trained somehow. According to him and official estimates, North Korea provided around 12,000 new recruits to Russia. However, the deployment of these troops proved to be an ineffective and costly decision. Hodges elaborates on the consequences of this move. The problem is, of course, that they are used as cannon fodder. The North Korean troops suffered enormous casualties. Ukrainian officers who encountered these troops described their tactics as what their grandfathers used in the Korean War, employing outdated and ineffective strategies, such as charging across open fields, reminiscent of the Korean War tactics of the 1950s. This type of combat is not only outdated, but also highly ineffective against a modern, well-equipped opponent like Ukraine. Still, the mere use of North Korean troops speaks volumes about Russia's dire situation. It was obvious then and now that the country is running out of resources, both in terms of weaponry and human capital. The fact that Russia is so desperate for troops that it turns to North Korea for help, even at the cost of sending in poorly trained forces, underscores just how deeply flawed its military strategy has become. With these and Russian troops suffering catastrophic losses, Putin's ability to maintain a prolonged war effort is increasingly in question. By now, Hodges and Fox's prediction about Russia's future is probably starting to make a lot of sense. From the failure to achieve air superiority, overestimating their military strengths, relying on outdated tactics, to the desperate need for foreign help like North Korean troops and weapons, these are all signs of a military in decline. Another sign of a military in decline? Lying through your teeth and firing off empty threats. The Oreshnik missile is the perfect example. Putin portrayed the Oreshnik missile as a revolutionary hypersonic weapon capable of speeding past any defense, with a Mach 10 velocity and multiple warheads that would make it nearly impossible to intercept. He made bold claims that the missile would give Russia a decisive edge, and even suggested it could alter the course of the war. In reality, the Oreshnik turned out to be far less impressive. Military experts quickly pointed out that its technology was based on old systems, essentially a patchwork of previous missile technologies reassembled with minimal new components. In fact, many specialists estimate that only about 10% of the missile's components are truly new. Despite its speed, its accuracy is questionable, and it's not a practical tool for conventional warfare, as seen in the Dnipro strike, where its impact was more psychological than strategic. Hodges called Putin's grand promises about the Oreshnik the last attempt by the Russian side to threaten the West with a nuclear weapon. He added that by now, no one truly believes that Russia will use nuclear weapons, labeling the entire campaign as a wasted effort. Of course, Putin certainly isn't ready to admit defeat, quite the contrary. He recently began Russia's biggest military call-up in years, totaling 160,000 men aged 18 to 30. This new conscription wave has to do with his grand plan to increase the Russian military size to 2.39 million troops, with 1.5 of them serving actively. Now, does this seem like a man who's going to accept a ceasefire and call it quits? Absolutely not. Putin's escalation, both in terms of military mobilization and public rhetoric, shows that he's fully committed to pushing forward no matter the cost. This brings us to Hodges' prediction about Russia's future. When asked how Russian militarism could be stopped, he didn't mince words. The solution, as Hodges saw it, was simple: defeat. In his words, they have to be defeated. If they are not defeated, then this will continue and there will be another Putin after this one, or somebody like him. Reform in Russia only comes after they are finally beaten in a conflict, and we should not be scared of that. We should not worry about, oh my gosh, what happens. He went on to stress that the defeat of Russia's militarism wasn't just crucial for the West, but also for the Russian people. For the benefit of Russian people as well as Europe, they have to be defeated. Perhaps reforms could take place inside Russia that would benefit 140 million people instead of what they have now, where only 1 million benefit from all that wealth. So what does this mean for Russia's future? It's clear. Unless Russia is decisively defeated, the cycle of militarism will continue. Putin's actions only reinforce the necessity of this outcome. But the good news is that Hodges' prediction is not a distant, uncertain future. It's on the horizon. Every misstep, every failure of Russian strategy, every crack in its armor is leading to this inevitable conclusion. The end of Russian militarism is closer than it may seem. The question now isn't if Putin will be defeated, but when. Although Hodges didn't give an exact timeline for this defeat, Fox certainly did, and his prediction, well, it doesn't look good for Putin. In Fox's words, Putin at the moment, while he's got his friend in the White House, thinks that he could push on. But how long for? I only give it a few months. I think we are coming to a decision point in the summer. A few months? That's not a long time at all. Putin's window to push forward is closing fast. His moment of reckoning is coming. Just think about it. The man who's been clinging to power, threatening the world with nuclear weapons, and pushing his military to the brink, has only a handful of months left before it all comes crashing down. By summer, we might just see the beginning of the end of his reign. Game over for Putin. Of course, there's one man who could alter this course, and his name is Donald Trump. Trump and Putin's relationship is complex, to put it lightly, but in recent months it's clear that they see each other as allies in some ways. That's why Fox referred to Trump as Putin's friend in the White House. Putin views Trump as his potential ticket to a new global positioning, an escape from the declining state of Russia's economy and society, with the hope that Trump could provide the necessary shift in international relations to his advantage. As Fox explains, Putin doesn't want to be seen as a supplicant, but as an equal partner to the US. This desire to avoid humiliation is central to Putin's view of the world and his ambitions. Trump, for his part, has often positioned himself as a leader who seeks peace and the end of wars, even going so far as to express interest in receiving a Nobel Peace Prize for such efforts. However, Fox notes the difference in what each leader views as a win. In Trump's eyes, a negotiated settlement that avoids further escalation or loss of life might be seen as a success. But for Putin, the idea of a win is far more tied to his ability to present it to Russia in a way that avoids humiliation. He can't afford to make peace unless it's framed as a victory for Russia, particularly after so many Russian lives have been lost in the conflict. This tension, Trump's desire for a quick resolution and Putin's need for a narrative of triumph, creates a volatile dynamic. Trump's solution might not be as straightforward as he envisions, and Putin's reluctance to back down without a win could drag the conflict out longer than the world is prepared for, or it could end it suddenly. After all, Trump isn't exactly known as someone who plays by the rules or waits for the perfect moment. His impulsive, often erratic decision-making could force Putin into a corner where he has no choice but to make a deal. And let's say that the war in Ukraine does end like that, with a ceasefire and not Putin's defeat. What would this resolution mean for the future? If the war in Ukraine were to end with a ceasefire, it would likely be a temporary solution at best, and the consequences of such an outcome could shape the future in ways we might not be ready for. Fox, in his assessment, expressed skepticism about the possibility of a short-term ceasefire. "I don't think Putin's serious about a short-term ceasefire at all," he stated, emphasizing that the Russian president is likely just biding his time to build momentum for his forces, particularly with heavily armored units, as summer approaches. The reality is that a ceasefire is less than 50-50, meaning it's not likely in the immediate future, as Putin's strategy is far more aggressive and persistent. So in the event of such a ceasefire, the need for security guarantees for Ukraine becomes paramount. While some may consider peacekeepers or international observers as a solution, Hodges noted that the only true, reliable security guarantee is NATO membership. He pointed out how countries like Finland and Poland, living next to hostile neighbors, have built formidable defensive systems and reserve forces ready to mobilize quickly. For Ukraine, a similar long-term defense strategy will be crucial. Without NATO's protective umbrella, Ukraine will be vulnerable to future aggression. The idea of alternative security arrangements such as United Nations peacekeeping missions is impractical. As Hodges stated, any peacekeeping force would need to be equipped with the capacity to act forcefully, not just observe, because Russia's track record of violating agreements is well known. He highlighted that such a force should have real soldiers with capability, authorized to take action when Russia violates the ceasefire. That's right, Hodges said when Russia violates the ceasefire, not if. His choice of words speaks volumes about the fragility of any agreement with a country like Russia, a country that has repeatedly breached the Minsk ceasefire agreements and abolished them mere 2 days before launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not exactly a shining example of keeping promises. That's why Hodges was unequivocal about Ukraine's future in NATO. He strongly believes Ukraine should be a member, not just for its own security, but for the entire region's stability. "I absolutely believe that Ukraine should be a NATO member," he emphasized, citing the boost that Ukrainian forces and their defense industry would bring to the alliance. Ukraine's entry into NATO would strengthen European security by providing a large, experienced military force and a growing defense industry. He dismissed fears about a NATO war with Russia, pointing out that if Russia can't defeat Ukraine with limited Western support, it would be illogical to assume they could take on NATO's full military might. While some Western European countries might be uneasy, Hodges suggested that just as Poland quickly moved to change perceptions and meet NATO standards, Ukraine could follow suit post-conflict, gaining the support of key NATO members. However, if NATO membership isn't immediately attainable, the much-discussed coalition of the willing should step in to offer support. Yet Fox expressed frustration with the existing notion of this coalition. According to him, it's been more of a diplomatic show than a practical solution. He warned that a coalition composed of hesitant countries wouldn't provide the kind of boots-on-the-ground presence necessary to keep peace and enforce agreements. The smaller, more capable nations like the Baltics and Norway, he noted, are proving to be more proactive in their approach. But he also stressed the importance of strategic thinking, suggesting that NATO and its allies need to prepare for the worst-case scenario, planning for the potential collapse of Ukraine's military, or even a diplomatic shift like a buddy-buddy agreement between Putin and Trump, which would leave Europe vulnerable. After all, after recent leaks, we all know what the Trump administration thinks of Europe. We believe the words used were freeloaders and pathetic. With so many moving pieces at play, the future of the war in Ukraine remains uncertain. However, one thing has definitely remained the same. Experts have repeatedly predicted the end of Putin's regime, yet here he is, still standing, over 3 years into the invasion. So is this time truly different? Will the mounting pressure, both on the battlefield and diplomatically, finally lead to his defeat? Or will the status quo continue, with Putin leveraging every tool at his disposal to push forward? The answers to these questions will determine not only Ukraine's future, but also the security and stability of Europe for years to come. That's why we want to hear your answers in the comments section below. Do you think that this is the beginning of the end for Putin, or is he just getting started? Let us know what you think.